The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
The debate over the 2020 fiscal year budget is underway, and one of the people who will be heavily involved in the budget writing process is State Representative Deb Lavender. The Kirkwood Democrat joins us on the latest edition of Politically Speaking to preview the budget process and some big issues that will be coming through the House over the next few weeks. Let's hit the music.
This is Politically Speaking, the longest-running episodic podcast about Missouri politics.
It's a little complicated in Bolivar because there is a Parsons family there.
But we also knew that it was important to make sure that we got to where we needed to go.
You know, if you walk in a room and you're getting ready to make a decision and everybody in the room looks like you need to stop.
And right now what happens in the United States Senate is as critical as anywhere else in the country.
I really want the state to succeed.
Well, we want everybody to know that we're all working together.
I just worked hard to try to build my name where I didn't have the money.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining us for the third time on this show, returning for the first time since 2017.
Deb Lavender.
State representative from the Kirkwood area.
District 90, yes, and Glendale, Warson Woods, Webster, Sunset Hills.
Yeah, it's a great district, and I think I asked you this last time. It includes the Magic House, right?
Yes, I get the Magic House.
I was there yesterday with my son. We made it to an hour and a half of play before I was like, I've had enough.
Terrific.
We're going home.
Thank you for coming to Kirkwood.
You're very welcome. So we're going to be spending a lot of time on this show talking about the upcoming discussion over the Missouri budget. You're a member of the House Budget Committee, and I know that this is kind of your bailiwick in the Missouri House. I'll just start off with kind of a general question. What is kind of your observation view of how Missouri's budgetary situation is going? Because my observation is this year it may be okay, but in subsequent years, unless the revenue situation turns around, Missouri may be in a world of trouble.
Well, I completely agree. So this is my third year on budget. In the last 2 years, especially as we get close to deliberations in the House, where I want to help physically disabled people, education, people in need, I'm constantly told we just don't have the money. And so for me, priorities aren't being put into our budget because we don't have the money. You've heard me speak over the last 8 years. We've cut taxes to the degree of $800 million coming out of our yearly revenue. That's a lot of money. When I want $700,000 to help put people back into bed tonight that are physically disabled, when we talk about transportation of getting kids in rural Missouri to schools, $800 million is a lot of money that we've cut over the last 8 years. The last 2 years, we've continued to cut taxes, and right now our revenue is down close to $350 million year to date, where it was a year ago. So some huge red flags on the horizon for what revenue will be in the future years. Some of the tax cuts that we've made have triggers that will put them into place over the next couple of years still. So I'm with you. I have great concerns about how much revenue we'll have in our state in the next couple of years.
My understanding is the reason why this particular fiscal year may not be like a calamity is that in the last fiscal year there was a big surplus that couldn't be spent for various reasons, and that's basically going to fill in the budgetary gap. I know that's kind of an oversimplification of what's going on.
Right, and it's not even that we couldn't spend it. We realized it at the end of the fiscal year. We go June to July, and so at the end of last fiscal year was when we had the, I believe, $245 million in excess of what we had anticipated getting. And you're absolutely right. That money was put in the bank. So this year, as we're behind monies, we know we have that large cushion from last year to make things whole. Then going forward, if we're down another $350 million, we don't have that cushion, and then we've got to start cutting more services.
Playing out kind of in, I was going to say the background, but this has definitely become a public aspect of this discussion, is the Department of Revenue situation, where a lot of Missourians are getting these surprise tax bills for various reasons. I don't want to disclose too much personal information here, but just to showcase what people may be going through. My family got a pretty large federal refund this year because we had a child and we didn't update our forms, which meant that, we were probably withholding too much money. So you would think that we would have gotten a large Missouri refund too, right? Wrong, $20 in refund.
Right.
So when you have a situation where somebody who has like a $2,900 federal refund is only getting $20,
yes.
I have to imagine that if it's a situation where somebody's only getting like a $200 refund, they may actually owe money based on their situation. Then that's a very oversimplification of
right.
it, but has that been kind of what you've discovered too when you've been delving into this issue?
Well, yes. And what's happened is there was a doubling of standard deductibility. And because of that, the way so many Missourians would have calculated their withhold state tax, sometimes you put down zero, hoping a little bit more is taken out, you get a refund. That zero now actually took you in the other direction. And so we took out less money instead of more money. You actually are a favorable Missourian right now that we owe you money. The average tax returns right now, the average person owes $65 more than they would have in the last couple of years. And the average refund is down $70. A lot of people, and we may argue with whether or not it's good financial planning, but a lot of people do taxes that they'll get a refund. And maybe they plan a vacation on that. Maybe they plan new tires or a new refrigerator or new flooring. And so for a lot of people, the loss of that refund is a big deal. And then again, a lot of our people are owing more money than they thought they were going to. And so those are the surprise tax bills that my minority leader, Crystal Quaid, has been talking about since December.
Now, one of the things that she's proposed, and I know that there have been other Democrats who have proposed, is allowing people who have a certain tax bill, so maybe like $200 or less, to either get an extension or to be able to do a payment plan. And I don't think that proposal has been seen very favorably by the governor. I think some Republicans actually have been pretty favorable to that idea because I think they've proposed similar things.
Right.
How realistic do you think it is that type of legislation, whether it either be through somebody in your caucus or a Republican who agrees with you, makes it to the finish line?
I think it will. It's gaining more traction as we go forward. Unfortunately for the Director of Revenues, he did admit some wrongdoing the last couple of weeks, and he's now resigned. I think with him having admitted that the tables were incorrect and they kind of had been purposely put that way, information that was going to come out in September was withheld, and of course we're concerned about the political implications 2 months before an election, that information was withheld. I think there is gaining interest in helping our middle and low-income Missourians who suddenly have this surprise tax bill. There's two things. There's penalty if you don't pay on time, and then there's interest on if you don't pay on time. And we want to afford people the opportunity of a couple of months grace period that they're able to catch up on what they owe the state without being penalized. It was our error. I say ours, the state of Missouri's error. We shouldn't penalize the people of Missouri because of our error.
Another issue that's kind of ruminating through the Budget Committee is House Budget Chairman Cody Smith's proposal on transportation. Just as a quick backgrounder, the governor in his State of the State speech talked about a bonding plan for, I guess, a little over 200 bridges is worth $350 million. And Representative Smith has proposed a plan of putting in $100 million in general revenue, I guess, for 3 or 4 years, just paying for the bridges directly as opposed to bonding them out. This is actually a clip of Representative Smith talking about his proposal.
The difference in the two approaches would save the state $100 million ultimately over the course of 15 years of not borrowing the $350 million as proposed in the bonding proposal. So for me, it's a pretty simple fiscal policy choice that if we can have a little discipline in the short term, we can save a lot of money on the back end, and I'm going to continue to look for ways to do that.
It seems like Republican House leadership is behind this proposal, and also it should just be noted that the House Budget Chairman has a lot of power and influence over financial matters. Doesn't have unlimited influence because there's a whole nother chamber in the Senate that is not super enamored with this plan. What's kind of your take on this? I could see some benefit of just paying as you go because the aforementioned interest will cost the state money and it could be going to other things. But I think that Senator Schatz, the Senate President Pro Tem, has said, not doing it the way the governor wants could put federal funding at risk. What's been kind of your reaction to all this?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Chairman Smith says. So if we borrow the money, we have 10 or 15 years that we need to pay that back. And where we just kind of talked about how our revenue is starting to be of concern to a lot of us, we still economically are in a good time period. And so that's intriguing by itself. Revenues are going down in a good economic time. Would not be a surprise to think we would go into recession over the next 10 years that this bond would be in place. And so then a $30, $40, $45 million payment to pay back this loan may suddenly then take on higher significance on what cuts we might have to make in the future if revenue continues to decline. The interesting part is the $100 million a year, and Representative Smith is in his second term and theoretically could have 6 years on the budget and could follow through with his promise of $100 million a year to MoDOT to repair these bridges. MoDOT needs to plan. They can't just take $100 million today and build the bridges tomorrow. There's a 2 to 3 year planning time period, and they have some of those bridges already planned in line. But to plan out that far, what if Representative Smith decides to go to Congress and a seat opens up for him, or he goes to the Senate, or there's so many things that happen to legislators during their term and time period. So if he gets off this target over the next couple of years, is the next budget chair going to do the same thing? Handing $100 million to the Senate in a budget on an open line feels a little dangerous from a House point of view, that they may decide to do different things with that $100 million. So there's some different concerns. I do appreciate not borrowing the money, not having to pay that back, but then there's still some other pitfalls that might come across this plan.
I hear all the time, kind of colloquially, like, why doesn't the legislature do more about transportation? And as much as it's easy to, criticize the legislature for doing things, I think that this squarely falls on the Missouri voters. They had a chance to raise taxes in 2014, sales taxes, and decided not to. They had a chance to raise the gas tax last year and decided not to. And there's clearly a need to repair the state's roads and bridges. But it doesn't seem like the people who often have to decide whether to raise taxes have appetite for shelling out any additional money. And I think I don't really think the governor wanted to do this bonding plan, but felt he had no other choice.
Right. The two things that I'll counter with you is I think we've been deceptive to our voters. So as you said, the first go-round, we asked for a sales tax to pay for roads and bridges. We know sales tax is one of the most regressive ways of taxation. So the lowest income people pay a higher percentage of their earnings on a sales tax than, say, our state income tax. So that's the first, I think, good reason why that one may not have passed. But this gas tax last year, and we were deceptive. And again, I say we, the Missouri legislature, told you, the voter, that we were going to raise gas tax to pay for highway patrol. And on our House floor, when this passed, it was like, well, if rural Missouri knows we're paying highway patrol, they'll be more likely to vote for it than if we tell them it's a gas tax to do roads and bridges.
Which seems odd, because I feel like it was marketed as, a gas tax for roads.
Yeah, but I had people call and say, shame on you, this was deceptive language, why didn't you just put it out there front and center?
Right.
And I had quite a few people push back that if we had not cut corporate taxes to the tune of $800 million in revenue per year, so I think a lot of people also saw that the state gives large corporations tax cuts. So why are you asking me now to pay for my roads when you've given other people a significant tax cut?
Is it possible that there could be some combination of the various ideas for transportation? This is like, I'm going to call this the Rosenbaum plan, just to take myself credit for it. Maybe you still have bonding, but instead of doing like $30 million, you do like $100 million to start, and then maybe do $100 million the next year. And just so it's not for 15 years, you pay less interest that way. You're still paying some interest, but you then save the state a little bit of money that way.
Right.
Is that the solution here?
Well, it's certainly a good option to be considering. I'm happy to share with you Cody Smith's phone number and let you plug your idea and see what he thinks about it.
I just hope that he invites me to the bill signing if that ends up being what happens.
That would be terrific.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
I want to talk about an issue that is going to be discussed by the House at large, but it has gone through the House Budget Committee in some form, and that's low-income housing tax credits. Now, the reason I'm asking you about it is right before, I guess, the end of last year's session, or maybe even like after session ended, I don't remember the timeline, the House Budget Committee basically deactivated the low-income housing tax credit. And maybe I'm even explaining this incorrectly, but it was kind of controversial because there was feeling that the House Budget Committee really didn't have the authority to do this. But I don't think anyone has really challenged this yet because it's kind of a moot point because the Missouri Housing Development Commission hasn't really issued state tax credits yet.
Right. I think it's a moot point. And it followed on the heels of Greitens deciding to not fund low-income tax credits in the November of his first year in office. And then with all of the controversy with Greitens, and prior to his resignation, I think the chairman at that time, Scott Fitzpatrick, didn't want there to be concern with if Greitens resigned and if, as has happened, Governor Parsons came in. We thought Parsons was a little bit more favorable to tax credits than Greitens had been. We didn't want there to be any appearance of impropriety if Parsons had stepped in and then gave the tax credits.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of fill in the blanks here. And I don't want to relitigate this whole situation because I think that this is an important policy. But there was a lot of conjecture and accusation that the money that went to Al Watkins was from the low-income housing tax credit community. And that's actually never been proven.
No.
Some of the developers involved in that have never actually said whether they did it or not.
Right.
So I think that I even asked this to Chairman Fitzpatrick directly if he was doing this to make sure that legislators could vote on impeachment and kind of have some assurance to the public that they weren't just doing this to start the low-income housing tax credit back up again. I hope I'm explaining this correctly.
Yeah, and I didn't think of it that way. That's certainly another way of trying to make sure there wasn't a conflict of interest, and that's what I saw as far as just for Governor Parson, that we were going to eliminate that as a possibility to attempt to keep it cleaner in the process. But I think with you, there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of uncertainty on the benefit that the state gives. Many of my colleagues want there to be a higher return of investment. If we give $100 million in tax credits for low-income housing, they want to see, 1.5% to 2.5% return, which for me, housing and low-income housing has so many other benefits. I don't need an additional return on our money. Housing and stable housing helps with health care. It helps with education. It helps with reentry program from people getting out of prison. There's so many aspects to housing that are important to us as a society that I'm okay the state gives $1 and it costs $1 to put up a low-income housing. There are parameters in place, there are rules in place. These buildings have to be well-made. They have to be inspected on a very regular basis. They have to last for more than 30 years as far as sustainability. So we really have some good parameters to make sure that we're getting good quality buildings made.
So the Governor Parson had said very directly, including in an interview to me, that he was not going to restart the program until the legislature changed the program. And without going into gory detail, he has the ability to do that because he's appointed some members to the MHDC. He's also appointed several of the statewide officials that are on the MHDC. And I'm not saying that he told all those people, hey, don't do anything until we change it, but he could. And I think that that's kind of what happened as a way to leverage the legislature to act in perhaps a more positive way than what Greitens intended.
Hey, let me just put in real quick. Sure. MHDC is Missouri Housing Development Corporation or Commission. And that is the commission that actually approves the tax credits and who gets them.
Right.
And so it all runs through that commission.
Yes,
so,
thank you for that clarification.
Yep.
So there was a bill that passed the Senate that basically said that 77.5% of the federal tax credit would be available for the state tax credit. This is Senator Dan Hageman. He's a Republican from Northwest Missouri. He was the sponsor of this legislation, explaining it a little bit more.
We ended up at adjusting it at a percentage of what the federal tax credits are. It ended up at 72.5%. That was through some negotiation to get to that point. So the Senate bill really just dealt with capping how much money are we willing to dedicate at this place and time to that type of program. And quite honestly, the other issue is just to get the program back up and going again. So there was some desire for reforms. There's been some discussion of other process reforms, but I chose to stay with just a cap, thinking that the process reforms really would be best suited for rules and regulations, and to do that. It is a difficult, complicated issue, and I really think that the rules and regulations would be the best on some of the process reforms that may be found. So we just dealt with the cap.
I think it was kind of one of the major accomplishments of the first half that a bill like this made it through the Senate. I'm sure that there are some people who absolutely hate the low-income housing tax credit program who think that 77.5% is not enough. But from some people who have been critical of the program I've talked to, they actually were surprised it got that low, given how many people support this program. Mm-hmm. How do you think this is going to fare in the House? Because I think there's bipartisan support for this program. And I understand the arguments against it and that it's inefficient and that it benefits for-profit companies. But having visited a lot of these developments, sometimes this is the best housing some of these people are ever going to get. Right. And as you correctly mentioned, they have to be up to a certain standard of livability and quality. And I do see some legitimate benefit. So with that as a backdrop, how do you think that this bill is going to fare in the House?
Well, I think it will fare well in the House. There are some of us, bipartisan, are concerned with the amount of tax credits that our state has and how it does have an impact on our budget. But I think so many of us feel that this is important. I do think Senator Hageman's 77.5%, I think that's negotiable on our side. I think you may actually see some people try to take it up a little bit on our side to maybe not 100%, a little bit higher. And then in conference committee, we'll probably still kind of split the difference, maybe an 80 or 85%.
Yeah, which would still save the state long term because the tax
Right.
credit is divvied out over a 10-year period. It would probably save the state a few $100 million
Right.
in long term.
Right.
And it also should be noted that the federal tax credit is still available for a lot of these
Right.
at 100% of the level.
And don't forget, I'm just going to go back to the stability of housing for education, for health care, for reentry programs. There's just so many good things that happen with stable housing that you may not be able to point to and say, hey, this saved us $10. But you get kids doing better in education. You get people stable in a home with a roof over their head, that their health care, their health benefits, and then reentry for people coming out of prison that so often have trouble getting their feet back on the ground to be productive, successful citizens again.
The last topic I want to talk with you about may or may not come up this year, but I think it will be on the agenda eventually, and that is the future of Amendment 1, known as Clean Missouri. It's really not Amendment 1 anymore. This is in the Missouri Constitution. It does a multitude of things. We were kind of listing it before the show. It caps lobbyist gifts, I think, at $5 an instance. It institutes a 2-year waiting period for lawmakers to become lobbyists. It made legislative emails open to the Sunshine Law, which is a part of it which has been controversial. We've talked about a lot on other shows. There are some what I would classify as pretty peripheral and minor changes to campaign finance. I know
trim the amount that you can donate to candidates a little bit from what was already in place from an amendment or ballot initiative 2 years ago.
But I think the reason why this is being relitigated again is the changes to state legislative redistricting, which before basically a commission of equal proportion to Republicans and Democrats, usually deadlocked, usually went to judges, and the judges more often than not draw the maps. Now there is a demographer that will be effectively appointed by the auditor. I say effectively because they're going to the auditor will solicit nominees. They'll show them to the Senate leaders. The Senate leaders will be able to eliminate people, and then the auditor will randomly select the demographer, and the demographer has to draw districts by a certain criteria. We have talked about this endlessly on this show, and frankly, the reason I wanted to ask you about it is a lot of the guests I've talked to, including some of your Democrat colleagues, have been extremely negative towards this process, and I know that you take a different perspective that I think the listeners should hear.
Well, I think this is good for our state. Gerrymandering has been a conversation across our nation for the last many years. A couple of U.S. Supreme Court challenges and opinions that have come out. If we just take the last presidential election where Trump received 60%, not even quite 60% of the votes in Missouri, you could say Missouri has 60% very strongly identified Republicans. If we took that same 60% into the House of Representatives for Missouri, we'd have 98 state reps that are Republican. Today we have 117. So that, to me, is gerrymandering of our state, that we really have manipulated where people live based on party preference that decides who's elected. Some of my colleagues who are opposed to this, and I have great concerns with them, and I would like to be responsible, are our African-American colleagues that are worried that we will dilute their representation in the State House. And so I don't share their concerns, and neither do I share their history of how we've treated African Americans in this nation from 400 years ago, which is when the first ship arrived from Africa to enslave these people. So where I don't share that history, I don't have quite the same concerns that they have. And at the same time, I'm very concerned that we do protect our populations, minority populations, that they do have their fair share of representation in our state house and in our state in general.
Mm-hmm. And I've talked about this on other shows, and I'm a big fan of not scurrying around the margins. I think that there have been some African Americans who have found Republicans to be more reliable allies in redistricting. I may be talking about congressional here, but I am also talking about state than Democrats. Because if you look back at the history, there's been a pretty antagonistic relationship between white Democrats and black Democrats and getting districts, especially in the St. Louis area, that are majority African American. And I'm not saying all African American political figures believe this way, but a lot of them believe that it makes more sense to have very African American districts where you are almost certain to elect an African American than to potentially spread that population out westward and perhaps make some districts more competitive. Because even if you keep it around 50%, it's still possible for a white candidate to win based off a lot of things. I think that's the concern. I'm fully aware that there's language in Clean Missouri that's aimed at protecting communities of color, but I think it's going to be up to a judge about whether that scenario I just mentioned will actually is actually allowable.
Well, and today we have districts with our African American colleagues that have an 80% African American population and an 80% Democrat performing index. And so I do think that we can alter that slightly and still have the assurance that we'll have African Americans elected that represent those areas. So that would be my commitment. But from a policy point of view, from a Democrat point of view in the state of Missouri, if we just look at that one number I gave you, and please remember, Trump winning by 20 points in the state of Missouri was an extreme outlier. Obama lost by less than 1%. I think it was 3 votes per precinct in the state of Missouri. I don't think he lost by a whole lot more in 12, maybe even let's say it was 5 or 6 points. This 20-point division, again, we'd have 98 Republicans on the House floor, and we have 117 today. Mm-hmm. I think that affects Missouri. I think that affects the policies. I think it affects our rural communities, everything from education to health care. We're not, and pardon me for getting a little off topic, we're not even considering expanding Medicaid. We are about ready to spend $35 million on Medicaid transformation in the state of Missouri, and we're not even putting on the table the conversation of expansion. Not that that's what I certainly hope they would do that, but not even that that's how our Republican majority would go, but that we're not even considering that as an option, to me is because we have 117 Republicans in the House. Is it 24 in the Senate, supermajorities?
It's a supermajority. I sometimes lose count because Lauren Arthur won her seat.
Right.
So I'm going to... I think it's 24. Right. If it's 25, then you can strike me with lightning right now.
But it just, for me, the importance of having equitableness from the state elections to how we're represented locally then all in the State House, I think that's important for the long-term policies of Missouri.
I've been kind of direct about this. I don't really think there's much drama about whether this is going to be, and when I say this, I mean the redistricting system is going to be put back on the ballot. I think it's almost an inevitability. The question is it going to, are the legislators going to act in 2019 or 2020 to put this on the ballot? And I think another question is how many Democrats are going to vote for it. I could see a lot of the Black Caucus end up voting for this on both hands. I'm curious to hear how this is playing in your caucus. We've already kind of touched on that. The Republicans don't need anybody from your caucus to pass this, but I think that I've even said this to Speaker Haar, I think that they want Democrats to vote for something like this so they avoid headlines saying Republicans tried to override the will of the people. I think they would much rather have a legitimate bipartisan vote on this so they can avoid that. So that's a verbose observation, but I'm interested how this is playing in your caucus.
I don't know more than a very small handful of my colleagues who would be willing to vote yes on a redistricting process. I haven't touched base with them very recently, but it was a small handful that seem to have the most concerns. You may have more update information.
I don't.
Seeing them more personally.
But I have not done a poll of them, but this is kind of the way I gauge it. If I see Lacey Clay and Maria Chappelle-Nadal agree on an issue, and they have had a long-standing political feud, it signals to me that it's pretty deep. There's pretty deep opposition within the African-American community. It is not universal.
Right. I'm going to say it's
clear.
Deep in that category. I don't know that I've seen the depth of that in other categories, and I think some of my other colleagues see the lack of compassion of policy for people in Missouri and realize that having more Democrats in Jeff City are going to help their districts as much and more than the representation.
The legislature could put something on the ballot in 2020, but I would expect the same campaign apparatus that caused Clean Missouri to pass will be revved up. And I think that it's going to be a fairly difficult question for opponents of this to answer. Why should voters repeal something that they just passed? And I totally understand that this was marketed as like, let's get big money out of politics. And the redistricting part was mentioned in ads, although it was not like the main thing emphasized in marketing. But I would also push back that when reporters were doing stories on this, we talked about the redistricting part for hours and hours and hours.
And I have many friends who collected signatures, and their most excited aspect of it was redistricting. And so I know many of the signature collectors, the volunteers especially, that was as much why they spent their getting signatures for this initiative, because they wanted that redistricting piece.
Well, Representative, I want to just thank you for your time this afternoon. We're going to be following the budget situation very closely, as well as the Clean Missouri, which we'll probably be talking about for the rest of our lives at this point.
Well, at least over the next 18 months, probably. Well, thank you, and I appreciate this is my third opportunity to be with you. I appreciate that. I don't know what your record is.
5.
All right. Well, I've got 3 more years in the legislation from today, so maybe I'll be able to challenge that record.
And you're running for re-election?
I'll be on the ballot in 2020. I'll be going for my last term as a state rep. I do enjoy the opportunity to work in the House. I really enjoy being on the Budget Committee and digging down and finding where there's unused money and how we can better serve the people of Missouri.
And I just got to point this out, that you ran for this seat, 3 times before you won it?
Yep. It was my 4th election that I finally won.
And
yes.
Last year, did you have an opponent last year?
You know, I did not have an opponent last year, so I was one of the incredibly fortunate individuals. I'm very thankful for that opportunity, but no, I was unopposed in 2018.
It must be a weird feeling going from pushing the ball up the hill and then getting to a point where you're now heavily favored for re-election, probably,
yes.
Especially given that the area that you represent used to be a swing district, I think is trending definitely more in the blue direction.
I think so too, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity and for the people that I get to serve and that have let me have the opportunity to be over there for 3 terms now.
For all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. Follow me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. How could people follow you on Twitter or any other parts of the World Wide Web?
At Deb Lavender, and I'm on Facebook, Lavender for State Rep, and just Deb Lavender.
Thank you very much. Until next time, so long.